About 3.5 months ago, I canceled my pre-order of the Canon R5, which was supposed to be this incredible, amazing camera for video, but it ended up being better suited for photo. So with all the overheating issues, I decided to cancel it and go with the Sony A7s III. So in this video, I'm going to be reviewing that new camera, the Sony A7s III. Let's jump in. For about 10 years now, I've owned Panasonic cameras. I started with the Panasonic AF100 and then bought a couple GH4s. From there, invested a lot into the Micro Four Thirds lenses, so I was heavily into that ecosystem. And then the GH5 came out and we bought a couple of those. We almost switched to the Sony A7 III when that came out. There wasn't enough reason for us to make the switch, but with the Sony A7s III, they basically changed and improved everything that the Sony A7 III did wrong, kept what they did right. They gave creators exactly what they asked for: 4K 120, 422 10-bit, great autofocus, an articulating screen. The rolling shutter was reduced, and they really made a beast of a camera. So let's dive into the review. I'll start with the rolling shutter. On the A7s III, even though it's not a global shutter, the rolling shutter is almost non-existent in comparison to old cameras. It's there a little bit, but I would say this camera has solved that problem and it's not something people will be complaining about anymore. So that's awesome. Now let's talk about the resolution. I think 4K is enough, especially for the next few years, for the things that we shoot. And the fact that they gave us 422 10-bit recording in all modes, even slow motion, is a huge win, plus no recording limit. Unlike Canon's, where it caps out around 30 minutes, on the Sony, you can record for as long as the battery will last or until the card fills up. I think this will prove to be one of the best camera releases for video because the features it has are comparable to some of the higher-end cinema cameras. All right, we are in downtown Toronto right now, and we're just skating up to Dundas Square. There's a building called the H&M building. It has these really cool white panel windows, and you've probably seen them before in other videos, but we're gonna go get some skateboarding shots out front of there. I think this camera will do very well for Sony. It's getting great reviews and it fits right into a professional workflow. And I think that's what I like the best about this camera. They've given you all professional modes, and this can be used alongside cinema cameras as like a B or C camera. And you know, in a lot of cases, this actually could be a great A camera. For example, through the full-size HDMI port, they've given you the ability to record 16-bit RAW using an external recorder. Now, at the time of making this video, I think there's only one monitor that can take advantage of that. As time goes on, more monitors will be released, more external devices that can record the full potential of what this camera can output. And talking about frame rates, on the GH5 cameras, we couldn't shoot 120 frames in 4K. We were limited to 1080. But on the A7s III, we can shoot 120 frames a second in 4K. And again, it's 422 10-bit, which so far has been awesome after reviewing all the footage over the last few days that we've filmed. So I'm really happy with the look of the 4K 120 mode. And if you did want a higher frame rate, they offered 240 frames a second in full HD. So that's a cool feature for some higher speed shooting. On the GH5, we were limited to, I think, 180 frames a second, I believe, in 1080. So I'm pretty happy with the frame rates that they offer with this camera. At 120 frames a second, shooting on other cameras, it's always felt like the image was a little too soft or the bitrate wasn't high enough. And on the A7s III, because the bitrate is much higher than these other cameras, it allows for much higher quality for these slow motion modes. Even though this camera doesn't have a fan inside, they've improved the way the heat is dispersed away from the camera so that it maintains a cooler temperature while operating, and I have not had it overheat once on me. I did change the overheat setting to the high mode so that it can go a little further before it'll give you the warning, and I've gone through 3 full batteries shooting at 120 frames a second pretty much all day long. I don't think overheating is going to be that big of a deal on this camera. For that base ISO. Another feature that we're pretty happy about on the A7S III versus other cameras, especially even the Canon R5, is the dynamic range. I don't have an R5, so I can't test that, but on paper, it shows that the A7S III has a few more stops of a dynamic range over the R5. Next, let's talk about low light. I love shooting in low light scenarios because you can control the lighting and it just makes for a much more fun and creative shoot. So when the A7S III was announced, I was excited about the low light performance because they decided to go with 12 megapixels instead of 24 or more like the A7 III had. And typically with their prior cameras, or even on the GH5 to the GH5S, when they say S, that means that it's meant for lower light scenarios. The A7S III compared to the GH5, this camera just destroys the GH5, it's not even a comparison. However, while this is very good in low light, I didn't really see that much of an advantage over the A7 III because they were going with the higher bit rates, higher dynamic range, higher frame rates, 4:2 10-bit in all modes. They focused more on that side of things instead of making it drastically better than prior cameras. Now for stabilization, this camera does have IBIS, but coming from the GH5, I think the A7S III isn't as good at stabilizing the footage in the body as the GH5 was. But Sony also included something called Steady Shot. By default, it's set to standard, but you can also set it to active, and then it'll crop in slightly. I found that this does a pretty good job, especially when shooting 24p and just doing some handheld stuff. You can get much more stable footage, and it's a little closer to what you'd expect from like a GH5. Now, if you wanted to take that a step further, there's software called Catalyst Browse that you can download, and you can run your Sony footage through it, and it's actually pretty incredible how stable it can make it. However, you have to crank your shutter speed really, really high. I prefer to shoot, double the frame rate or as close to that as I can. It's not that big of a deal for us to not stabilize footage because I'd prefer to not shoot with such a high shutter speed. This just means we'll spend a little more time shooting using the gimbals instead. Regarding the color and tone and the picture profiles of the camera, I shot a whole day in S-Log 3. That gives you a little bit more dynamic range. That's the purpose of shooting S-Log. However, I found in low light scenarios, when shooting in S-Log, it introduces a little more noise than I'd like to have. So we're gonna pick and choose when to use a standard profile and when to use S-Log. On commercial shoots or in bright daylight, we'll definitely go the S-Log route because that will give us a higher dynamic range. And for low light scenarios, we'll switch to something else. I think S-Log 2 is a little better in low light. So it really depends on the situation and what you're going for. But if you want a quicker post-production process and you don't really care about getting things exactly the best they can be, then just turning off the picture profile and going with a standard profile is the way to go. For memory cards, the A7S III can shoot with the new CF Express Type A cards. I believe Sony is the first manufacturer to make them, and it can also shoot with SD cards. So it has 2 CF Express Type A and 2 SD slots on the camera. So I think that's really cool that they added 4 slots total. It allows you to choose which ones you want to go with. The CF Express Type A are super expensive. We actually ordered 2, received them, found out that V90 SD cards can do almost every single mode except for the S&Q 4K 120 all intra mode. That's the highest bitrate you can record on the camera. Apparently it captures at 1200 megabits per second, which would be higher than the V90s can handle, and then saves it at a 600 megabits per second. I talked to Gerald Undone on Twitter about this, and he confirmed that there is something else going on. If you look at the fine print, it actually does say 1200 for the all intra 120 mode. That means SD cards cannot be used for that specific mode, but because it's all intra, the file sizes are going to be gigantic. So for me personally, I will not be using that probably ever. If I want that really, really high quality, I'm just going to use an external recorder and shoot RAW. That makes far more sense than filling up all this hard drive space and not taking advantage of the full camera in that scenario. So about a month ago, before we received the camera, I sent back the CF Express Type A cards, and then decided to buy V90 SD cards instead. I'll leave a link in the description for the exact ones that we bought in case you just want to make things easy, you click and buy. Besides the all intro mode, which records always new information on every frame, that's why the file sizes are so big, they also have a more compressed version called S. Now this will be the same as what was on the A7 III, for example, and they also have a new HEVC, which is H.265, as another option as well. Let me warn you that HEVC files will be very difficult to edit with. For that whole day when I shot the 4K footage at 120 frames a second, 422 10-bit, that was all in the HEVC codec, and my computer is having a tough time editing it. The file sizes are small, but because it's so heavily compressed, computers have a really hard time extracting all that information out of the codec and playing back in real time. And then you throw 422 10-bit in the mix and it has an even harder time because there's millions and millions of new colors introduced. So to get around that, I've started to incorporate proxies into my editing. If you want to learn how to create proxies, we have a tutorial on the channel, so look for that. And coming from the GH5, where when you shoot slow-mo, it interprets the footage and saves it in camera as slow motion. So if you shoot 120, it saves it at 24, which means it stretches out all the frames and you get slow motion. On the A7S III, to do that, you need to go into the S&Q mode, which is slow and quick. So I didn't know that initially, and when I first started to shoot in the 120p mode, when I got home, that footage was 120p. It was still 120 frames a second, even though my timeline in Premiere was at 23.976. It was basically just dropping all those frames and playing back at real time. To get around that, you have to go into Premiere, interpret all the footage to 24, and then you can drag it back down, and then it'll be slow motion. And now let's talk about autofocus on the A7S III. As mentioned, this was one of the reasons why we didn't switch to Sony ahead of time, because the A7 III's autofocus was okay, but not perfect. You'd find it would hunt a little bit for finding the focus mark, or would randomly just fall off and focus on the background. And for that reason, it wasn't really going to work for me.
And for that reason, I'm out.
But on the A7S III, they've drastically improved how the autofocus system works. And so far, I would say that it is perfect. I haven't had any issues with it. And this is the first camera that I can feel confident using autofocus with. And I've always done manual focusing. I come from doing feature films or short films using, cinema cameras. You need a dedicated team. So for me, using manual focus has always been very comfortable. It's like second nature. However, I gotta say, it's pretty pleasant to use autofocus on the A7S III because it just works. I am super impressed with the autofocus on the A7S III. I can't believe how accurate it is. It's so fast, and even at night, like the footage right now is 12,800 ISO. That's brighter than what I can see in actual real life with my eyes. Pretty cool. And just to show you how good this is, like going all the way back, like it is incredible how good this is. Like, it's pretty good. In terms of the ergonomics of the camera, it just feels good to use. It seems like it's weather sealed very well. The button layout seems familiar from the A7 III. I think it's a very similar casing. But the menu system and layout has been improved on the A7S III. I know from talking to other Sony users and from using the A7 III that the menu on other Sony cameras or older Sony cameras has always been pretty complex and kind of confusing. So I'm glad that they improved it, and I still think there's some tweaking that needs to happen, but overall it's nothing to really complain about now. I think you can find everything that you're looking for fairly quickly, especially with all the customized settings that you can implement into the camera. For us overall, the A7S III is, I would say, the perfect camera. The only thing that I think would make this the more perfect camera would be if it could shoot RAW internally. And the other thing would probably be a higher megapixel count, because 12 megapixels is on the lower side. For social media, that's fine. I think I'd still default to shooting time lapses on the GH5, which isn't really ideal for photos, but it does have an 18 megapixel camera. And again, for time lapses, that's a little better for what I need it for. So overall, after shooting with this camera for about a week and going through all the footage, it really has all the features that I'd want in a camera, and it's just fun to use. And I love that autofocus just works. I'm really happy with this camera. However, there's one important factor that I want to talk about. It is a bit pricey. So if you already have a camera system such as GH5 or the A7 III, those are still excellent cameras and you don't need to upgrade. We switched because it just made sense for us at this time. But if you're on a limited budget or you already have a camera, you really don't need to upgrade and switch to a different system just because it's new. Quite honestly, I could keep shooting with the GH5. I could still get the job done. It would just be a little different, maybe a little trickier or harder in certain situations. So that's the review of this camera. I hope you found it helpful. Let me know if you have any questions about it and I'll try to answer those. And thanks for watching. Since you've made it this far in the video, you've probably liked the video. So give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, subscribe, and hit the bell to be notified when we release new videos. We have over 60 other filmmaking tutorials on the channel. So again, subscribe, hit the bell to be notified when we upload, and we'll see you next time.